Imagine for a moment that you are holding a smartphone that never runs out of battery, but every single app on it is meticulously designed to make you angry, anxious, or profoundly envious. You are scrolling through an infinite, glowing feed where influencers argue over who has the most authentic lifestyle, where politicians demand your absolute, unblinking loyalty, and where a relentless culture tells you that your personal truth is the only moral compass that matters. You feel more connected to the world than any generation in human history, yet, in the quiet moments before sleep, you realize you have never felt more isolated or more violently divided from your neighbors. You might think this hyper-polarized, status-obsessed, digital nightmare is a uniquely 21st century American invention, but you would be mistaken. Long before the first line of code was written or the first like button was clicked, there was a place that felt exactly like this. It was a city called Corinth, and it was the pulsing, high-voltage heart of the Roman Empire. Corinth was not a quiet, dusty village, lost in the pages of history. It was the New York City, the Las Vegas, and the Silicon Valley of the ancient world, all rolled into one volatile metropolis. It was a high-speed hub of global commerce, extreme wealth, and intellectual vanity, where making it meant everything and stepping on the heads of others to climb the social ladder was simply considered a sound business model. To the ancient mind, to Corinthianize meant to live a life of reckless decadence and unapologetic self-indulgence. Into this beautiful, chaotic mess, a man named Paul, a gritty tent maker with a radical, disruptive message, sent a letter. He wasn't just sending a polite religious greeting to a small club of believers. He was dropping a spiritual bomb into a culture that was dangerously obsessed with celebrity, status, and clout. This letter, which we know today as 1 Corinthians, is arguably the most American book in the entire Bible. It speaks directly to the exact same ghosts that haunt our shopping malls and our social media comment sections, the toxic obsession with followers, the confusion of a hyper-permissive society, the litigious nature of our relationships, and the heartbreaking reality of a community that has forgotten how to actually love. If you have ever looked at your news feed and wondered how we became so tribal, or if you have ever looked in the mirror and wondered why having everything still feels like having nothing, then this ancient story is your story. We are about to go on a journey through a letter written to a people who were drowning in their own freedom. We are going to look through the lens of a digital Corinth, a world where our screens have become our temples and our influences have become our gods. Paul's message was not a pat on the back, it was a total system reboot. Over the next hour, we aren't just reading history, we are performing a diagnostic on our own souls to see why the foolishness of a man on a cross is actually the only thing that can save a world obsessed with its own brilliance. As we move deeper into the heart of Paul's first letter, we find ourselves standing in the middle of a spiritual civil war that looks strikingly familiar to anyone who has ever scrolled through a modern political feed or a celebrity gossip site. In the first 4 chapters, Paul identifies a cancer that was eating away at the Corinthian community, and he calls it by its true name, factionalism. You see, the Corinthians were obsessed with what we would call brand identity. They weren't just followers of Jesus, they were fans of specific influences. Some claimed, "I follow Paul, the gritty, intellectual founder." Others, likely those who preferred a more polished, eloquent style, claimed, "I follow Apollos, a man known for his brilliant rhetoric." Still others leaned into tradition, saying, "I follow Cephas or Peter." And then there was the most dangerous group of all the super-spiritual ones who smugly claimed, "I follow Christ," as if they had a private, VIP connection to God that bypassed everyone else. This wasn't a church, it was a collection of competing fan clubs. It was Team Paul versus Team Apollos, and Paul's response is a blistering critique of our human desire to find our worth in the people we follow rather than the message they carry. In the 21st century American context, we have perfected this Corinthian pathology. We live in a society defined by clout and platforms. We feel more important when we are part of a tribe that seems to be winning, whether that's a political party, a specific theological camp, or even a community centered around a popular YouTuber or podcaster. We take the brilliance of a leader and make it our own armor, using their words to bash our opponents. Paul looks at this and asks a question that cuts through 2 millennia of ego. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? He is trying to show us that when we elevate human leaders, even good ones, to the status of idols, we are actually shrinking the gospel to fit our own insecurities. The Corinthians loved wisdom, or at least they loved the appearance of wisdom. In ancient Greece, the sophists were the superstars of the day. They were professional orators who could argue any side of a case with such beauty and charisma that the truth mattered less than the performance. For the Corinthians, the gospel was just another philosophy to be debated, polished, and used to show off how smart they were. But Paul hits them with a reality check that is intentionally offensive. The message of the cross is foolishness. To the American mind, which prizes efficiency, success, and the self-made narrative, the idea that the creator of the universe would save the world by dying a shameful, agonizing death on a Roman execution rack is fundamentally illogical. It ruins the brand. It's bad PR. In a world that worshipped strength, the cross was the ultimate symbol of weakness. In a culture that worshipped the winners, Jesus looked like the ultimate loser. But Paul argues that this foolishness is exactly where the power of God is hidden. He explains that God intentionally chose the things the world considers low and despised to shame the wise and the strong. Why? So that no human being could ever stand in God's presence and brag about their own resume. This is a direct assault on the American meritocracy. We are taught from birth that you get what you earn, that your value is tied to your GPA, your salary, or your social media following. Paul turns that upside down. He tells us that the only way to truly find yourself is to realize that you have nothing to offer God except your need for Him. He's telling the intellectuals in Corinth and the educated elite in America that their degrees and their sophisticated arguments are just chaff if they don't have the humility of the cross. Paul doesn't stop there. He takes the influencers himself and Apollos and strips away their celebrity status. He uses the metaphors of a field and a building to explain their roles. He says, "I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God has been making it grow." In other words, the leaders are just farmhands. They are just construction workers. You don't worship the guy who laid the bricks. You admire the architect and the owner of the house. Paul is desperately trying to deplatform himself because he knows that if the Corinthians are looking at him, they aren't looking at Jesus. He describes the apostles not as pampered VIPs, but as the scum of the earth and the refuse of the world. He paints a picture of apostles being led like prisoners in a victory parade, destined for death, while the Corinthians are sitting back, feeling rich and wise and honored. It is a sarcastic, biting wake-up call. He's saying, if the message of the cross has made you feel superior to others, you haven't actually understood the cross. This section of the letter is a demolition of the human ego. Paul is calling us to an intellectual suicide, not a rejection of thinking, but a rejection of the pride that comes with it. He warns that anyone who thinks they are wise by the standards of this age must become a fool, so that they may become truly wise. This is the great paradox of the gospel. To be filled, you must first be empty. To be honored by God, you must be willing to be ignored by the world. In our digital Corinth, where every post is a bid for attention and every comment is an attempt to prove our intellectual dominance, Paul's words are a cooling balm for a fevered soul. He is inviting us to stop the exhausting game of who's who and who's right. He is telling us that we don't belong to the influences we follow. Rather, everything Paul, Apollos, the world, life, death, the present, and the future, everything belongs to us because we belong to Christ, and Christ belongs to God. When you realize that you are already part of the ultimate inner circle through the cross, the need to join a petty human tribe simply evaporates. We are called to be stewards of the mysteries of God, not managers of our own reputation. In a culture that demands we build our brand, Paul reminds us that there is only one foundation that will survive the fire of judgment, and his name is Jesus Christ. Everything else is just wood, hay, and stubble, destined to burn away in the light of eternity. Now, we must address the most uncomfortable reality of our digital Corinth, the collapse of moral boundaries in a world that has traded absolute truth for subjective vibes. As we move into chapters 5 through 7, Paul confronts a society that looks eerily like modern-day America, a place where tolerance has been weaponized to silence conviction, and where the pursuit of personal pleasure has become the highest form of worship. In the United States, we are raised on the sacred mantra of, "It's my life, and I can do what I want." We believe that as long as we aren't hurting anyone, our private choices, especially our sexual and relational ones, are off limits to everyone else. But Paul shatters this illusion of the private life by revealing that in a connected community, there is no such thing as a victimless sin. He begins with a scandal that even the pagan Romans found shocking. A man in the Corinthian church was in a sexual relationship with his stepmother. What was even more disturbing to Paul than the act itself was the church's reaction. They weren't mourning, they were puffed up. They were bragging about how inclusive and progressive they were for accepting this behavior. They had mistaken apathy for grace. In our current culture of post-truth, we see this play out every day. We are terrified of being labeled judgmental, so we stand by and watch those we care about destroy themselves in the name of freedom. Paul uses a brilliant, almost scientific metaphor to explain why this is a fatal mistake. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. In the digital age, we might call this viral toxicity. Just as one malicious line of code can crash an entire operating system, or one toxic influencer can poison an entire online subculture, a single unaddressed moral failure in a community compromises the integrity of the whole. Paul isn't calling for a cancel culture fueled by hate. He is calling for a restoration culture fueled by holiness. He argues that if we don't have the courage to draw lines, we eventually lose our identity altogether. He challenges the Corinthians and us to realize that being a follower of the way means our lives must look tangibly different from the chaos of the world around us. This leads into a profound discussion on the nature of the human body. The Corinthians had a slogan that sounds like it was ripped straight from a modern lifestyle blog. Everything is permissible for me. They argued that since the spirit is what matters, what they did with their physical bodies, eating, drinking, or sexual indulgence was irrelevant. It was just biological functions. But Paul stops them in their tracks with a theological bombshell that is perhaps the most offensive statement to the modern American ear. You are not your own. In a nation built on the self-made dream, where we claim total ownership over our bodies, our time, and our choices, Paul tells us that we are actually bought with a price. He explains that your body is not a disposable shell or a tool for personal gratification. It is the temple of the Holy Spirit. Think about the weight of that imagery. In the ancient world, a temple was where heaven and earth met. It was a sacred space that required reverence and order. Paul is telling us that our physical existence, our skin, our bones, our desires, is the hardware designed to run divine software. When we treat our bodies as mere commodities to be sold for likes or used for fleeting pleasures, we are desecrating a sanctuary. This is why he commands us to flee from sexual immorality. He doesn't say debate it or negotiate with it. He says run. He understands that sexual intimacy isn't just a physical act. It's a soul-level union that has the power to either build us up or tear us apart. By honoring the temple, we aren't limiting our freedom. We are protecting our design. As he pivots to the complexities of marriage, singleness, and devotion in chapter 7, Paul maintains this high view of integrity. Whether you are married or single, your primary status is defined by your devotion to God. He acknowledges the pressures of a world that is passing away, a sentiment that resonates deeply in our fast-paced, anxious society where everything feels temporary. He encourages the Corinthians to live with a sense of holy detachment, not to be cold or unfeeling, but to ensure that no earthly relationship or worldly pursuit becomes an idol. In a digital Corinth that constantly pressures us to find our other half or to obsess over our relationship status as a metric of success, Paul points us toward a deeper stability. Integrity in this post-truth world is the radical act of living as if God is the only audience that truly matters. It is the quiet, consistent discipline of aligning our private habits with our public confession, ensuring that the temple of our lives remains a place where the presence of God can actually dwell. If there is one word that defines the American psyche more than any other, it is rights. From our founding documents to our modern-day social media debates, we are a people obsessed with our personal liberties, our freedom of speech, and our constitutional protections. We live in a society that treats personal autonomy not just as a legal framework, but as a secular religion. The phrase, "I have the right to," is the ultimate conversation ender in our culture. But as we step into chapters 8 through 10 of Paul's letter to the Corinthians, we find him performing a radical, almost surgical intervention on this very concept. He enters the courtroom of our self-sovereignty and asks a question that feels profoundly alien to the modern ear. Just because you have the right to do something, does it mean you should do it? This is the rights trap, the seductive idea that our personal freedom is the highest good, regardless of how it affects the person standing next to us. The specific controversy in Corinth sounds strange to us at first. It was about whether or not a Christian could eat meat that had been previously sacrificed to pagan idols. In a city like Corinth, almost all the meat sold in the public market had some connection to a temple. For the enlightened Christians, the ones Paul calls the strong, this wasn't an issue. They had the knowledge that idols weren't real. They understood that a steak is just a steak, regardless of what ritual was performed over it. They felt they had the right to eat whatever they wanted. But there were others in the community, the weak, who had recently come out of paganism. For them, eating that meat felt like a betrayal of their new faith. It triggered their conscience and caused them deep spiritual distress. The strong looked at these people as being overly sensitive or intellectually inferior. They were essentially saying, "It's not my problem if you're offended. I know the truth, and I have the right to enjoy my dinner." Paul's response to this is a devastating critique of intellectual pride. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. He argues that if your knowledge leads you to trample on the soul of a brother or sister, then your knowledge is actually a form of spiritual failure. In our digital Corinth, we see this exact dynamic every single day. We use our facts, our logic, and our correct political or social takes as weapons to belittle those who don't see things as clearly as we do. We prioritize being right over being relational. We claim our right to post a scathing comment or share a divisive meme because it's the truth, ignoring the fact that our truth is wounding a real human being on the other side of the screen. Paul then does something remarkable in chapter 9. He uses his own life as a case study in the voluntary relinquishment of rights. As an apostle, Paul had the undisputed right to be financially supported by the church. He had the right to a wife, the right to a salary, and the right to a comfortable life, but he chose to give it all up. He worked with his own hands, making tents in the heat of the day, so that no one could accuse him of preaching for money. He didn't do this because he had to. He did it because he wanted to remove every possible barrier to the gospel. He famously writes about becoming all things to all people, becoming like a Jew to win the Jews, and like one under the law to win those under the law. This wasn't about being a people pleaser or having no backbone. It was about the strategic use of his freedom. Paul's definition of liberty isn't doing whatever I want. It is having the power to restrict myself for the sake of another. He compares this to an athlete training for the Olympics. An athlete has the right to eat junk food or sleep in, but they voluntarily give up those rights to win a prize that lasts. Paul is asking the American heart, what is your prize? Is it the temporary satisfaction of asserting your rights, or is it the eternal reward of seeing someone else find grace? In chapter 10, Paul takes us back to school, using the history of Israel in the wilderness as a warning mirror. He reminds the Corinthians and us that having spiritual privileges doesn't make us invincible. The Israelites had the rights of being God's chosen people. They saw the miracles, they ate the manna, they drank from the rock. Yet, they fell in the desert because they became arrogant and played with idolatry. Paul warns, if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. He is speaking directly to our modern overconfidence. We think we can handle our liberties. We think we can flirt with greed, obsession with status, or toxic online environments without it changing who we are. But Paul insists that you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot claim to follow the God of self-sacrificial love while simultaneously worshipping at the altar of your own ego and personal rights. The climax of this entire section is a principle that should be tattooed on the heart of every person living in a polarized society. No one should seek their own good, but the good of others. He concludes with the ultimate litmus test for our behavior. Whether we are eating, drinking, or posting on social media, do it all for the glory of God. This is the exit strategy from the rights trap. When we stop asking, what am I allowed to do? And start asking, what will most glorify God and most benefit my neighbor? Everything changes. It de-escalates the cultural wars. It turns our digital interactions from battlefields into mission fields. It transforms our rights from a shield we use to protect our comfort into a gift we lay down for the sake of the community. In a country that is currently tearing itself apart over individual sovereignty, Paul's ancient wisdom offers the only path toward true peace, a liberty that is so secure in Christ that it no longer feels the need to demand its own way. He invites us to move beyond the narrow, suffocating walls of our rights and into the wide open spaces of a love that seeks the flourishing of everyone else first. As we enter the fifth movement of Paul's letter, covering chapters 11 through 14, we encounter what I like to call the divine algorithm. In our modern digital landscape, we are all governed by algorithms, silent, invisible lines of code that determine what we see, who we interact with, and ultimately, how we perceive reality. These algorithms are meticulously engineered to maximize engagement, which, in our broken world, usually means they prioritize outrage, vanity, and the reinforcement of our own biases. They create echo chambers where we only hear the voices that sound like our own and only value the people who reflect our own status. But in these chapters, Paul introduces an entirely different operating system for human community. He moves from the theoretical discussions of rights and liberties into the gritty, beautiful, and often messy reality of how we actually live together as a collective body. He starts by addressing the most sacred gathering of the community, the Lord's Supper, and what he finds is a heartbreaking reflection of the socio-economic divisions that plague modern America. In Corinth, the wealthy members of the church were arriving early, feasting on expensive food and getting drunk, while the working-class members and the poor arrived late, only to find empty plates and cold stares. It was a potluck from hell. Paul's reaction is one of pure, holy indignation. He tells them that by ignoring the poor, they aren't just being rude, they are despising the church of God and failing to discern the body. To the American ear, which is so accustomed to exclusive spaces and the quiet segregation of wealth, Paul's message is a jarring reminder that at the table of God, your net worth and your social standing are completely irrelevant. If your spirituality doesn't change the way you treat the person with less than you, Paul argues that your spirituality is a sham. This leads directly into his profound teaching on the body of Christ in chapter 12. This is perhaps the most revolutionary organizational chart ever written. Paul uses the human anatomy as a metaphor for the church, arguing that diversity is not a problem to be solved, but a divine requirement for health. He explains that just as a body isn't made up of one giant eye or one massive ear, the community of faith must be a tapestry of different functions, backgrounds, and talents. In our current American culture, we tend to suffer from two opposite extremes. We either worship the superstars and the C-suite leaders, or we try to force everyone into a bland, uniform mold. Paul rejects both. He insists that the eye cannot say to the hand, "I don't need you." He goes even further, stating that the parts of the body that seem weaker or less honorable are actually the most indispensable. Think about that in the context of our digital Corinth. We obsess over the influencers with millions of followers, the ones who are loud, polished, and visible. But Paul suggests that the true health of the nation and the church depends on the hidden parts, the people who pray in secret, the ones who serve without a camera rolling, the blue-collar souls who keep the spiritual engine running. He calls us to a radical empathy where if one part suffers, every part suffers with it. This is the ultimate antidote to the hyper-individualism that is currently tearing the fabric of our society apart. We aren't just a collection of autonomous users, we are limbs and organs of a single living organism. Then, situated perfectly in the middle of this discussion on spiritual gifts and communal order, we find Chapter 13, the Manifesto of Love. In America, we have sentimentalized this chapter to the point of exhaustion. We read it at weddings while surrounded by flowers and lace, treating it as a romantic poem about feelings. But in its original context, 1 Corinthians 13 was a tactical strike against a prideful, divided community. It wasn't written for a bride and groom. It was written for people who were at each other's throats. Paul begins by saying that you can be the most talented person on earth. You can speak with the eloquence of angels. You can have the knowledge to solve every political problem. You can even give all your money to the poor. But if you don't have love, you are nothing but a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. In digital terms, you are just spam. You are noise without signal. Paul then defines love not as a feeling, but as a series of countercultural actions. Love is patient. It stays in the room when things get uncomfortable. Love is kind. It refuses to weaponize the truth to hurt others. Love does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. And perhaps most importantly for our cancel culture era, it keeps no record of wrongs. Imagine if this were the algorithm that drove our social media. Imagine a digital world where we didn't rejoice in the fail videos of our enemies, but instead rejoiced with the truth. Paul is describing a love that is agape, a sacrificial, choice-based commitment to the flourishing of the other, even when they don't deserve it. This love is the only thing that never fails. Everything else, our technological empires, our political dynasties, our sophisticated theological debates will eventually be stilled or pass away. We are currently living in a state of knowing in part, like looking into a poor reflection in a mirror. But Paul promises that one day we will see face to face. Until then, he leaves us with the 3 pillars of a meaningful life: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these, the one that governs all others, is love. Love is the most excellent way because it is the only thing that survives the transition from this world to the next. Finally, in chapter 14, Paul applies this algorithm of love to the actual practice of communication within the community. He tackles the controversial issue of speaking in tongues versus prophecy. While the Corinthians were obsessed with the spectacular, high-status gift of tongues which often looked impressive but didn't help anyone else, Paul urges them to pursue prophecy, which he defines as strengthening, encouraging, and comforting others. His guiding principle is a word that appears over and over again: edification. To edify means to build up. Paul's rule for any gathering, any speech, and any digital interaction is simple. Does this build the other person up, or does it just make you look good? He calls for order over chaos, arguing that God is not a God of disorder, but of peace. In a world of word salads, virtue signaling, and shouting matches, Paul's call for clear, intelligible, and loving communication is a breath of fresh air. He is teaching us that the purpose of our gifts isn't self-expression, it is communal service. Whether we are using our voices in a church or our thumbs on a screen, the divine algorithm demands that we prioritize the understanding and the peace of the outsider and the inquirer. Chapters 11 through 14 aren't just about ancient church rubrics. They are a blueprint for a society that values the person over the platform, the hidden over the hyped, and the lasting power of love over the fleeting high of being right. As we reach the final movement of this extraordinary letter, we find ourselves standing at the edge of the ultimate frontier, the boundary between time and eternity. In our digital Corinth, we are a culture obsessed with escaping the limitations of our biology. We spend billions of dollars on biohacking, anti-aging serums, and the Silicon Valley dream of digital immortality, where we hope to upload our consciousness into a cloud to live forever. We are terrified of the blue screen of death that awaits us all. Yet, for many in the modern West, life has become a flat, one-dimensional experience. We live for the weekend, for the next vacation, or for the next dopamine hit on our screens, because deep down, we suspect that when the light goes out, that's it. Some of the Corinthians had fallen into this exact same trap of nihilism. They were beginning to argue that there is no such thing as a physical resurrection. They wanted a spiritual religion that didn't involve the messiness of bodies or the hard reality of empty tombs. But in chapter 15, Paul performs what can only be described as a grand system override. He tells them, and he tells us, that if there is no resurrection, then the entire Christian faith is a glitch. It is a hollowed-out ghost app with no back-end server. He uses the Greek word kainos, meaning empty or vain. If Christ hasn't been raised, Paul says, your faith is useless. Your sins are still tethered to your soul, and we are, of all people, the most to be pitied. Paul doesn't just offer a vibe or a poetic hope. He presents a legal case. He lists the version history of the resurrection, the witnesses who saw the risen Jesus, Peter, the 12, and more than 500 people at once, most of whom were still alive to be interviewed when the letter was written. He is saying that the resurrection isn't a private truth or a subjective experience. It is a historical fact that changed the physics of the universe. To the American mind, which values evidence and seeing is believing, Paul offers a mountain of testimony. He then explains the logic of the resurrection using the metaphor of a seed. If you look at a dry, shriveled seed, you would never guess the glory of the oak tree hidden inside it. The seed must die in the dirt to unlock its true potential. Paul is telling us that our current physical bodies, the ones that get sick, the ones that age, the ones that let us down, are just the seeds. They are perishable, but we will be raised imperishable. We are currently living in the low-res version of ourselves, but the resurrection is the Ultra HD upgrade. He introduces the contrast between the first Adam, who brought death into the human source code, and the last Adam, Jesus, who brings a new, indestructible life. The climax of this chapter is perhaps the most defiant piece of writing in human history. Paul looks death right in the eye, the one thing we Americans try so hard to ignore, hide, and medicate away, and he mocks it. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? Because of the resurrection, death is no longer a period. It is a comma. It is not an exit. It is a doorway. This changes everything about how we live right now. If the future is secure, we don't have to be obsessed with building our own little kingdoms here. We don't have to cancel others to feel significant. We can be, as Paul says in the final verse of chapter 15, steadfast and immovable. We can work for justice, love our neighbors, and serve the unseen, because we know that in Christ our labor is never in vain. Finally, in chapter 16, Paul brings the grand theology down to the pavement of daily life. He talks about the collection for the Lord's people, the practical, financial side of being a community. He talks about his travel plans and sends greetings from friends. It's like the after-credits scene in a blockbuster movie. It reminds us that the hope of the resurrection isn't just for the clouds, it's for our wallets, our calendars, and our handshakes. He ends with a stark, beautiful cry, Maranatha, come, Lord. It is a prayer for the ultimate system update. He leaves the Corinthians and us with a final command that serves as the perfect summary of his entire message. Be on your guard. Stand firm in the faith. Be courageous. Be strong. Do everything in love. In a world of digital chaos and fleeting shadows, Paul points us toward a reality that is more solid than the ground we walk on. He invites us to live not as citizens of a dying empire, but as pioneers of a coming kingdom where death has already lost. As we bring this journey through the digital Corinth to a close, I find myself sitting in the quiet weight of Paul's final words, and I hope you are feeling it too. Reflecting on this ancient letter through our modern American lens has been more than just a historical exercise. It has been a profound mirror held up to the very fabric of our lives. We often pride ourselves on being part of the most advanced civilization to ever grace the earth. We have conquered the atom, we have touched the stars, and we have woven a digital web that connects every human soul in an instant. Yet, as we have seen through the struggles of the Corinthians, the human source code remains remarkably unchanged. We are still the same people longing for significance, prone to tribalism, and dangerously obsessed with our own rights. The same ghosts that haunted the marble streets of Corinth now haunt our silicon chip reality. We see them in the way we use our freedom as a weapon rather than a bridge, and in the way we elevate our personal truth above the sacrificial love that Paul describes as the only thing that truly lasts. The connection between the past, the present, and the future in this book is like a golden thread running through a tapestry of chaos. The past gives us the diagnosis. It shows us that without a foundational love, all our knowledge and clout are merely noise. The present is our testing ground, the arena where we decide whether we will be Team Paul, Team Apollos, or something far more radical part of the unified body of Christ. And the future? The future is the promise that the low-res frustrations of our current lives are not the end of the story. Paul points us toward a resurrection reality that is more solid than our smartphones and more enduring than our political empires. He tells us that while we currently see through a glass darkly, there is a face-to-face moment coming where the mysteries of our suffering and the divisions of our world will finally be healed. This is the ultimate system update for the human race. It is the hope that allows us to stand firm today, knowing that every act of kindness, every moment of self-restraint, and every word spoken in love is being woven into an eternal kingdom. I want to express my deepest gratitude to you for joining me on this deep dive. In a world of 10-second sound bites and mindless scrolling, you chose to spend this time engaging with something deeper, something that challenges the very core of who we are. It is my sincere hope that you don't just walk away with more information, but with a different perspective on the person you see in your newsfeed and the person you see in the mirror. We are all Corinthians in a way, struggling to live out a revolutionary love in a culture that rewards the loudest voice. But as Paul reminds us, the most excellent way is open to everyone. It doesn't require 1 million followers or a sophisticated degree. It only requires the humility to realize that we belong to each other because we belong to Him. If this story has moved you, or if it sparked a new way of looking at our modern world, I invite you to join our growing community. Please take a moment to hit the like button and share this video with someone who might be feeling overwhelmed by the noise of our current era. Your share could be the very encouragement they need today. I would also love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Which part of the digital Corinth resonated most with you? Are there other books of the Bible you'd like to see analyzed through this modern lens? Your feedback is what keeps this channel growing and helps us bring these ancient truths to life. If you haven't already, please subscribe and turn on those notifications so you don't miss our upcoming stories. We have so much more of the Bible's incredible narrative to explore together, revealing the timeless wisdom hidden in plain sight. Thank you for your support, your time, and your heart. Until next time, stay steadfast, stay courageous, and as Paul would say, do everything in love. I look forward to seeing you in our next story.